All right, guys. So last video we were talking about the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, and we talked about Brown versus Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycott, and kind of the birth of nonviolent protests. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how Montgomery and Brown kind of lead to an expansion of the civil rights movement throughout the nation, specifically in the South. And we're also going to talk about how the focus expands beyond just education. So we're going to be talking about those kinds of things, and before we move on to the rest of the movement. All right, so civil rights workers in the late 50s and early 60s are going to really, in a lot of ways, kind of latch on to this nonviolent philosophy that King and SCLC talk about. And this comes from Martin Luther King's study of nonviolent resistance by Mohandas Gandhi in India, who was protesting before and after the Second World War of protesting British control of India. So anyway, American civil rights leaders like James Farmer of CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, Martin Luther King Jr. of SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they agreed with Gandhi's idea of nonviolent philosophy. And another new leader that emerges during this time is a minister by the name of James Lawson. And Lawson is going to actually set up workshops to train young people how to engage in nonviolent direct action. And this is going to actually lead to the formation of SNCC down the road. All right, so the first real mass nonviolent protests begin with the sit-in movement. And what happens in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 students from a black school by the name of North Carolina A&T basically go to the Woolworths counter and they sit down. And the counters at that time, the lunch counters at that time, were segregated. And they sit down, they're told to move, and they refuse to move unless they've been served. So basically this touches off a string of sit-ins. Over the next few days at the Woolworths, you've got basically black students descend upon the Woolworths and sit in the seats and refuse to move until they've been waited on. And what it really does is it causes a lockdown of the Woolworths lunch counter. Nobody else can get in, so Woolworths is losing money. And basically they sit quietly and well behave, and at the end of each sit-in they end in prayer. So this sparks protests, sit-in protests all across the South, usually in cities that have a large black campus near them. So this is kind of the touchstone of this nationwide movement throughout the United States. In 1960, it's important, the Supreme Court also made a decision that said, it's basically unconstitutional for interstate bus facilities to be segregated. So CORE in the summer of 61, or CORE in 1961, sends a group of what are called Freedom Riders. And this is a multi-racial group. You had whites, blacks, young people, middle-aged people, clergy, all sorts of different kinds of people. They board buses in the north, and they ride. They're supposed to be riding to New Orleans. And at each stop along the way, they go into these facilities that are segregated. But by law, they're not supposed to be. So what happens is, as the Freedom Rides move on, they start to meet more and more resistance. And eventually, in places like Birmingham, they meet heavy violence. Many of them are beaten, sometimes within an inch of their lives. And in Anniston, Alabama, one of the buses is firebombed, and it actually results in the death of, I think, 2 riders. So, I mean, what it is an attempt to force the federal government to make the federal government enforce its own court laws or court rulings. So the sit-ins were very successful. They got lots of businesses to change their policies. And what it does, it marks a shift in the civil rights movement. Young African Americans are taking the mantle and pushing for more reforms. They're tired of waiting. And it also results in the formation of an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And SNCC becomes one of the most influential groups in the civil rights movement. The freedom rides basically go in two waves. The first wave is the core rides, which are called off after the fire bombings. It's just become too dangerous. Local police were not willing to protect them, so basically core called it off. What happens is SNCC moves in and continues. And again, they're trying to make the federal government enforce its own court orders. And it succeeds. Attorney General Robert Kennedy actually sends federal marshals to Montgomery to protect the riders. And so the Interstate Commerce Commission is forced to actually integrate the buses and train stations that should have been integrated on paper already. So this begins a pattern by which the movement will engage in direct action and be faced with violence, thus forcing the federal government to come in and guarantee their rights. So this is a pattern we're going to see throughout the movement. And here you got some, you got a picture of some young sit-in proponents sitting in at one of the cafes at one of the Woolworth's lunch counters. You can see all these young men, some not young men, have showed up to harass them. They pour sugar on them, milk, other types of drinks. Here's a beer bottle, and it's been poured on one. So you've got they take a lot of abuse during this time frame. All right, so you got on one front, it's an attempt to integrate businesses and other public facilities. On the other front, you got the education. The Supreme Court had ruled multiple times, not just in Brown versus Board of Education, but other times that colleges had to desegregate. So people began to push to force that to happen. In 1961, you had Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes that attempted to integrate the University of Georgia, and they're successful and actually graduate in 1963. James Meredith in 62, probably the most famous of these individuals, tries to enroll at the University of Mississippi at Ole Miss. And he arrives on campus and he actually has 500 federal marshals there to protect him because he'd already been threatened multiple times. And basically thousands of white protesters are there. Eventually, it breaks out into riots. And President Kennedy actually federalizes National Guard and sends them in to put down the riots. The protest was ended, but hundreds were injured as the soldiers went in and put down protesters. And 2 were actually killed. So it turns into really kind of a battle at the time. So anyway, the protests are broken. Meredith stayed at the university and got his degree in 1963, but he had to have a small force of marshals there to protect him the rest of his time. And of course, one y'all may have seen on Forrest Gump, the Integration University of Alabama by Vivian Malone and James Hood. Governor George Wallace himself tried to prevent the integration, but of course federal marshals were there, served him with a court order, and basically forced him to step aside. All right, so we're going to talk about 2 different parts of the movement and how they show the pattern that the movement kind of had developed on trying to guarantee black rights. The first is Albany, Georgia. And Albany, Georgia had ignored the ruling by the Interstate Commerce Commission that they had to integrate their bus stations. And in another case, we're going to talk about Birmingham, Alabama, which may have been the most segregated city in America at the time. So in Albany, what happens is SNCC begins a sit-in at the bus station. And SNCC members are arrested, over 500 members, but there's just not enough press coverage. So basically because there's no press coverage, the federal government never got involved because there wasn't any public outrage. So what local leaders did, what the SNCC leaders did is, or not SNCC, but the local leaders asked Martin Luther King to come. And the reason being, where King went, television cameras went. So King came, he was arrested, but the police chief of Albany had studied kind of the movement's tactics. So he understood that when King got there, that there was going to be press coming. And when the press got there, he released King. So then basically city officials came out and said, look, we'll negotiate, but we're not going to do it while King and the press are here. We'll negotiate with local leaders. So King leaves so they can begin those negotiations. And basically after King left, so did the video cameras, and the leaders of Albany said, we're not going to negotiate now. So after 9 months, it fails because they're unable to get the federal government active. Now in Birmingham, however, they have a much different process. First, the SCLC and other groups in Birmingham basically began with sit-ins and marches, and they were quickly arrested. King, while he was in jail, was informed that white clergy members had basically attacked him as saying he was causing trouble, stirring up nonsense and things of that nature. So King wrote probably the most famous document to come out of the civil rights movement, his letter from a Birmingham jail. And he answers those critics. He describes his philosophy of nonviolence and lays out a case for black equality. Anyway, so King is eventually let out, but fewer and fewer adults are receptive to marching because they worry about their jobs and their families and things of that nature. So what SCLC and the civil rights leaders there do is they start to allow children to march. So thousands of kids are going to start marching, and actually over 900 of them are arrested. Some as young as 6 years old, most teenagers. But anyway, they run out of room in the jails. So the police commissioner, Bull Connor, basically says, we can't arrest anymore. We don't have room. So he starts engaging in violent tactics to break up the demonstrations. You've probably seen the videos of fire hoses and attack dogs and police officers with billy clubs and things of that nature. But that gets on the news, and everybody around the nation sees that, and they're horrified by what's happened. So there's pressure put on federal government leaders to do that. And here you see a video. On the left-hand side, you have the attack dogs and the police with the batons, and on the right-hand side, you actually have the fire hoses on. And again, these are mostly children. So it really stirs the conscience of the United States. All right, like I said before, these videos we're going to continue, but they'll be on on my website, and you need to view those as well. And here you have a look at the freedom rides and how they win. In Anniston, it gets broken up, but then SNCC continues it from Nashville and on to Jackson. All right, so Birmingham, the violence of Birmingham really contributes to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Kennedy, who had not yet been assassinated, announces that he's going to ask. He goes on TV, makes a speech, and says, it's time that we pass this legislation. Also, and then two things happen that really increase support for it. Medgar Evers, a NAACP leader in Mississippi, was assassinated by Byron De La Beckwith, a Klan member. There's a lot of outrage about that. And then the March on Washington, obviously, August 28, 1963. King makes his most famous speech, which everybody knows, I Have a Dream speech. And that was made at the March on Washington. And it really pushes forward the case for the Civil Rights Act. And later that year, Kennedy is assassinated and Johnson becomes president. Johnson uses his skill as a legislator that we talked about in the last video, in a couple videos ago, to get the law passed. And he overcomes a filibuster by Strom Thurmond, and the Civil Rights Act is signed on July 2nd, 1964. And this basically bans discrimination in employment and in public housing. So we're going to talk next time about how it expands beyond the fight against segregation and into voting rights. And then we'll talk about some fractures that start to occur during the movement. So make sure you watch those videos. They're really interesting and shed a lot of light on the information. And we'll see you guys next time.